So thank you all for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate the invitation I received from Yuri. It is always always important to speak about this subject, but really appreciate the fact that University of Wisconsin, Rock County at Whitewater, Rock County is recognizing the importance of discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, especially in light of some of the things going on in our community as of late, that we have a chance to really engage in some dialogue. So um, I'm not going to speak the entire time, so I will have some. It will be open for questions and then dialogue if we want to have. But really wanted to start first and foremost with acknowledging Ralph Yarl, the Kansas City young man who was shot last Thursday, mistakenly going to the wrong household as he was going to pick his sisters up from their babysitter. Um, Such an unfortunate situation as he was, just a young man trying to do the right thing, trying to go use his little sisters, and ended up being shot twice through a doorway. So we pray for his recovery and hope that he survives. But it is part of that ongoing dialogue about how divisive we become and the importance of inclusion, the importance of equity, and the importance of people having seats at the table. So where I wanted to start today was really with kind of framing the state of the state. As we think about why inclusion is important and trying to create inclusive communities, we also have to get a gauge of where we actually are so that we know how to get to where we want to be. So those of you who know me know that I am a data nerd and look at a lot of statistics, especially around diversity, equity, inclusion, around racial and cultural disparities. So I was looking at some different demographic data, and then what I've been doing as of late is looking at demographic trends and then looking at some of our institutions to see how our institutions are doing in terms of keeping up with those demographic trends. So first and foremost, I was looking at population shifts. So just a few statistics to share with you. So like as of 2018, youth of color are now the majority of youth in the United States. So think about that. The majority of people under the age of 18 in the United States are now youth of color. By the year 2030, the majority of the US labor force will be people of color. And by about 2042, no single racial group will make up a majority in the United States. Whites will actually be about 43% of the country. The other 57% will be made up of racial minorities. So you see that there's this shift in our population. So what I've been looking at over time period is looking at to see where our institutions are and how they're shifting, if they're at all keeping up. And the reality of it is our major institutions have some real work to do in terms of making sure that the environments are inclusive, especially when it comes to positions of decision making and leadership. So one of the statistics I was looking at the other day said that there are roughly so I'm a nonprofit person. I've been in the nonprofit field my entire professional life, 30 years. So I was looking at our nonprofit institutions in the United States, and of the roughly 1.7 million nonprofit agencies in this country, 93% of those institutions are still headed by white people. So only 7% of those leadership roles, those CEO, executive director roles, are headed by people of color. So some work to do there. I was looking at Fortune 500 data. Right now, of the Fortune 500 CEOs, 4 African Americans currently have those seats. So, and only 20 women out of that 500 as well. So, could you try again? Quiet, Siri. So, really, some work that we need to do. We are living in a very segregated community, in a very segregated society. Even looking at crime statistics, even our crime is incredibly segregated. So, I was looking at some FBI data that said, so in the case of crimes against people, more than 80% of the time, the victim and the assailant, regardless of race or ethnicity, are the same race or ethnicity. So if you're a victim and you're assaulted by victim of assault or something, and you're white, chances are the assailant's white. If you're black, the assailant's going to be black. If you're Hispanic, the assailant's going to be Hispanic. Because crime is about opportunity. So even in our communities, the crime is incredibly segregated because our communities are incredibly segregated. So people are going after the people that they have access to. So just some of the pictures, some of the images, some of the things that are going on in this country in terms of what we face in terms of trying to push towards equity and inclusion. And I know the crime thing is interesting. It was an interesting thing to bring up, but it's very telling about how segregated our community truly is. Right now, the state of Wisconsin is considered the most segregated state in the United States. How many people knew that? Yeah. The most segregated state in the United States. Not Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia or any states like that, it's Wisconsin. Wisconsin's also the state that, when it comes to racial disparity, right now has the worst racial disparity data, especially black-white racial disparity data in the entire nation. So some work that we need to do. In fact, the 5 states with the worst black racial disparity data are all Midwestern states. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and South Dakota was in the top 5. But then when you look at quality of life information, study after study after study, what we see is Wisconsin at or near the bottom in terms of quality of life disparities. How do we address that? It starts with trying to figure out how to get more people at the table and making sure that when decisions are made, there are diverse voices at the table. Just sharing some of my experiences locally, it is probably 95% of the time that I go to community meetings, especially meetings where decisions are being made, where I am the only person of color in the room, and end up by default having to be that voice. And and what I found is, in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily that people are being malicious in terms of their discrimination. It's that people are just not thinking about it. Like the cultural norm has become, these are the people I'm connected to, these are the people I reach out to, and largely in those circles, especially in those leadership circles, the circles are white. So you miss that voice at the table as decisions are being made, as people are trying to consider how. And sometimes after the fact, after decisions are made or projects are done, people will come back to me and say, hey, Mark, why is it that no Black people come to this? Or why is it that no Hispanic people attend this? Or why can't we get a more diverse population to be involved in this situation? And my question always is, in the process of planning, did you have any people of color at the table? And the answer is invariably almost always no. And again, when I ask the question, well, why not? The answer quite often is, well, we just didn't think about it. So how do we change cultural norms? How do we get people to think more consciously about inclusion in all aspects of what we do? And it has to be a conscious effort. It can't be after the fact thoughts or circumstances. It's got to be from the beginning. When we look at our tables, when we look at our leadership groups, when we look at our committees, when we look at our organizations, how are we more conscious about making sure that there are more voices at the table and more diverse voices at the table? How are we making sure that we're more conscious of making sure that access and opportunity is equitable across the board? And that continues to be a major struggle. Like I said, as I look at the private sector, it's unfortunate to say, but I'm an anomaly. When you think about the leadership in our community, of even our public and private institutions, and you think about how many people of color in those leadership roles, you can literally count them on one hand in our county. So how do we start making some of those changes? How do we start making leadership opportunities available? How do we start bringing in people of color and people from different backgrounds into our organizations and start grooming them for leadership positions and giving those opportunities for growth? There is still very much a glass ceiling that people of color face as they're trying to advance in their careers. It is unfortunate to see, but it is the reality. The other thing that's going on in the world right now and in our country is you have significant pushback regarding anything related to diversity, equity, inclusion. We just saw it this past week in our own community. That idea that everything that's related to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion is about critical race theory, or it's about excluding white people, or it's about taking something from another community. And the reality of it is, one, most people who throw around the term critical race theory don't even understand what it actually means. It's just become a political buzzword. And the other part of this is, my question is, when did teaching historical fact become an issue? And why aren't people promoting and pushing it? I was looking at a list of banned books a few days ago, and I was appalled at some of the books that were on that list by authors like James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Richard Wright, some of our greatest contemporary African American authors, and those books will not be accessed in school districts all over the country any longer. How do we expose our young people, all of our young people, to authors of color, to artists of color, to mathematicians of color, to scientists, to musicians, if there's this big push to exclude? How do we make sure that people know that there's more to the world than just that smaller white community that you engage in, that homogeneous society that you're connected to? How do we work to make the world bigger for the adults that we work with, but most importantly for the children that we work with? I spend a lot of time in schools across our county, so elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the questions I ask all the educators right off the start is, can all your students see themselves in your classroom? And it seems like a really simple question, and it kind of is. But essentially what I'm asking you is, when you think about the makeup of even your space, what quotes do you have up in your classroom? What pictures and images do you have up in your space? What languages are you exposing your kids to? What authors are you reading? What scientists are you introducing them to? What mathematicians are you introducing them to? And largely, what they're reading, what they're seeing, what they're learning is all white. Think about my own school experience, and I was a senior in high school before I read my first school-assigned book by an African-American author, which also meant that all of my white classmates were seniors in high school before they read a book by an African-American author. So up until that point, the cultural norm was everybody we read was white. The people who wrote the best books were white. The people who wrote all the poems were white. The only exception to that was during Black History Month, when they would occasionally roll out, some poem by an African-American author, and we get to read a poem or we get to read a short story, and then it was put back on the shelf. But what about Hispanic authors? What about LGBTQ authors? How do we get those things into our classroom and into our kids' spaces? How do we make sure they're exposed to those things? And then how do we make sure we give kids the proper context so that they understand what they're reading? But if the cultural norm continues to be as it has been, that our priority remains white, our cultural icons remain primarily white, the education that we do remains Euro-centered and white-centered, then we're not expanding that for our young people at all. I'm working with some of the school districts in our smaller communities where you have these pretty homogeneous societies. I think about those kids going off to college or going out into the world and getting culture shocks. I've heard the stories from students. They step onto a college campus that is more diverse and they have a culture shock because they've not been exposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion at all. They've not been exposed to people from diverse backgrounds, not just from international students, but Black and brown people from their own country. The majority of white students go through their school years without being exposed to people of color. And that's not just true locally or regionally or at the state level, that's true nationally. So how do you engage in that exposure? How do you make sure that young people know that they're part of a global society and that global society is incredibly diverse? There has to be more of a conscious effort towards inclusion. Organizations like Diversity Action Team are amazing. Organizations like the YWCA that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion are incredible. But they are doing their work oftentimes without a lot of community support or a lot of community engagement. People are comfortable with their cultural norms. And it's hard to shift and push a cultural norm. It's hard to push something that's been ingrained in communities for years and years and years. And the reality of it is segregation has become that again. It's just the cultural norm in our communities. We don't question it. We don't even think about it. So how do we make ourselves more conscious and aware? I think about that time frame back in May 25th, 2020. That was the day that George Floyd was murdered. And from that point, for about a year, there was a lot of push around diversity, equity, and inclusion, organizations and institutions stepping out, making statements, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. but not doing any real work towards it. And after the frenzy around George Floyd started to die off, you started to see a regression, a societal regression, organizational regression, community regression. There was a lot of promise at that moment. The unfortunate thing about that moment, as we were paying attention to George Floyd and paying attention to the subsequent protests, is that very little came out of it in terms of real work, and very little came out of it in terms of true progress. You had a lot of businesses and corporations making statements, a lot of organizations signing on and posting things like Black Lives Matter that had never done it before, because it was easy and popular to do so. But now that it's not as easy 3 years later, now that it's not as popular 3 years later, many of those organizations that were very loud and very vocal at that time have completely retreated. It was a fad. It was something they latched on to the moment. It was a marketing tool. Hey, look, we're diverse. Pay attention to us. We care about George Floyd. But then when any controversy arose about that, people started to back off. We never got down to doing the work. We never got down to rolling our sleeves up and really engaging in the hard conversation around the history of racial discrimination in this country. We never got down to talking about the current situation of racial disparity in this country and how to really address and resolve it. At some point, we are going to have to. The more that we continue to try to sweep diversity, equity, and inclusion on the rug, the more issues we're going to have. The more that we decide to eliminate books from classrooms and subject matter from schools, the more that we squeeze tighter and tighter around those subjects, the more issues we're going to have. If we cannot be open and honest about who we were, how can we get to the place where we want to be? Whether people like it or not, or appreciate it or not, and I say this to people all the time, racism is as much a part of America as apple pie and Chevrolet. It's woven into the fabric of the country. Our country has been segregated since its inception. And although we've had pockets of time where we've seen advancement, over the past several years, if you talk to most people of color, they'll tell you that what they've seen is a regression. How do we make a long-term commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we create environments so that people feel safe and welcome? And how do we create access and opportunity so that there are more people at the table? And I understand that sometimes people get concerned about those pushes. You know, people want to make sure that that other people aren't being excluded, or that including people of color doesn't happen at the expense of white people. People don't like to share. People don't like to relinquish power and control. People don't even want to acknowledge the concept of privilege. I think about lessons that haven't been learned from South African apartheid. South African apartheid was an atrocious system. Blacks were excluded from so many things. Bottom of the barrel resources, treated like, not even like human beings, not even like second-class citizens. Wasn't even that good. And as the push to eliminate apartheid moved forward in the 80s, the biggest concern that white people had was that Black people were going to gain control of the country, and then they were going to take away their stuff. That essentially they were going to treat white people like white people had treated them for centuries. White people would be stripped of their institutions, of their houses, of their resources, of their money, and be left destitute. Well, the reason why that fear existed is because you spent 150 years doing it to another group of people. Fortunately, the transition in apartheid was a smoother one. That didn't happen. Nothing was taken away from anybody. There was a push to try to equal and level the playing field, which is still happening. But that was that fear. But if you mistreat people, if you disparage people, if you disrespect people, of course you're going to expect the counter. It was fortunate for that country and fortunate for the rest of the world that that's not what took place. It was fortunate that the people who stepped into power in South Africa were not vindictive and manipulative and vicious. Because given the treatment, quite honestly, they would have had every right to it. But they chose equity and equality for everybody. They chose not to strip anybody of anything, but figuring out how to create a playing field that was more level so that Black and brown people in that country had equitable access and opportunity for the first time ever. And unfortunately, we're not learning those. We didn't pay enough attention to what was going on there then. And we're, in a lot of ways, we were a mirror image of what was going on in South Africa. And we continue that. When you think about the wealth gap, the gap in home ownership, the lack of access to a number of things that people should have, just basic things. People aren't going to stick it. People aren't going to abide by that forever. Especially now that demographics in our country are changing, institutions have to move and start changing as well. Otherwise, we're going to have some serious issues moving forward in this country. From an economic standpoint, like I said, the labor force is changing. By 2030, the labor force is going to be predominantly people of color. But if our institutions haven't moved to train, educate, and hire people of color to get them into the labor force, then our businesses and our institutions are going to suffer. Our educational systems, was it 88% of our teachers in this country are white? How do you get more people of color into the education field? I already told you about our nonprofit statistics and what it looks like. Our population is changing, but we are still living in denial about those population changes because people are afraid of relinquishing power and control. It's funny because I was, as an African American kid or African American person growing up in this country, especially over the past decade, when I see signs, when I see people protesting, when I see white people protesting with signs like, we're going to take our country back, my question is, take your country back from who? White people control 80% of the wealth and every major institution in this country. So who are you taking your country back from? What's that about? It's fear. It's fear that someday somebody's going to do to that population what that population has done other populations historically in this country. The very foundation of this country was founded on discrimination and segregation. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, naming African Americans 3/5 of a human being and essentially not even recognizing indigenous people as human beings at all. And quite honestly, I don't know that we've gotten any better from that point. We have some individual examples of success. We have a few pockets of advancement. But overall, you're talking about populations of people who essentially have not had access and opportunity. Now, laws have changed, but what hasn't changed a great deal in our country, I would say, are sentiments and rhetoric and cultural norms. We've outlawed discrimination, but discrimination still persists. We've outlawed racial bias, but racial bias still exists. The practices haven't changed. People have passed down discriminatory practices from generation to generation to generation. How do you change those cultural norms? How do you start educating people to think differently, to see differently? How do you get people to understand that continuing to exclude other people or whole populations of people out of the mainstream is only detrimental to all of us? Yes, it affects those populations, but Again, as our populations transition, it is going to start affecting everybody. Our colleges and our institutions, our nonprofit organizations, and certainly our for-profit businesses. If you have an unskilled, untrained workforce, you can't produce. And if you continue to exclude certain populations from access and opportunity, from training and education, who are you going to substitute them with? Who's going to do the work? We have to get smarter about this. And it's not about liking people or hugging people or loving everybody. It's at some point, understanding the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes about survival. If we want our institutions to survive and thrive, if we want our businesses to survive and thrive, if we want our communities to survive and thrive, we have to figure out how to include. Have to figure it out. One of my favorite civil rights icons, George Farmer, said, "If we can't sit at the table, then we'll knock its legs off." He said it more bluntly, it had a couple of swear words in there. But that's kind of the place that we're at right now. If we don't start making seats at the table and keeping those doors open, they're going to get pushed open. If we don't start being more conscious and aware about the way that we treat people and the way that we engage people, people are going to start to push back. This doesn't have to be adversarial. It doesn't have to be at the expense of anyone. There's enough to go around if people are willing to share. But we have one population that is used to having it all. And other populations that just want a piece. I don't want to take away anybody's privileges. I just want access to those privileges also. I don't want to exclude anybody from opportunities. I just want to make sure those opportunities are equitable. We're still at a point in 2023 where you walk into certain spaces and you know you're not welcome and accepted for no other reason than the color of your skin. I'm more likely to get mistaken for the help than I am for a CEO of a multi-million-dollar organization. It's happened to me consistently. How do we change those narratives so that people who look like me in positions of power and control aren't anomalies? How do we change the narrative so that people have equitable access to home ownership, so that people have access to healthcare, so that people have access to quality education? How do we establish some baseline cultural norms that we all agree upon, that everybody adheres to? How do we establish some basic moral values about what people deserve and what people should have access and opportunity to, and that everybody has access to it? We can't continue to go on as we are. It is absolutely to the detriment of us all. When I think about a community like Rock County, I think about some of our history. The history of segregation, the history of housing discrimination. The fact that multiple communities in Rock County were sundown towns. And although that term is no longer legal and that practice is no longer legal, the sentiment still remains largely, where people of color still feel largely unwelcome in certain communities. How do we do a better job of educating, pushing, challenging, and holding people accountable? Are people even willing to do so? One of the things I always think about is we talk about the silent majority and how the majority of the people want diversity, want inclusion, want equity. But I am really, really starting to question whether or not that is true. Do people really want it, or is it just what people are saying because it's the right thing to say? And are we willing to really go through what it takes to get there? Because those are hard conversations and those are hard actions. There's no magic wand to get a segregated community or a segregated nation into a more inclusive country. It's just hard work and it's conscious efforts. But it's also about holding people accountable. How do we get good-hearted, well-intentioned people who want things to change to start pushing other people? How do we get them to start holding other people accountable? I've done diversity, equity, inclusion work all over the place for 2 decades now. And I go in, you do the education, you do the training, you do the discussions, you put things in place, and then people don't follow through. And the biggest piece is accountability. Holding my coworkers accountable, holding my employees accountable, holding my friends and family accountable, challenging their biases and their bigotry and their stereotypes. Setting some cultural standards in your spaces of work and in your community, and then adhering to them and holding people accountable for them. We can do all the education, all the training in the world, but at the end of the day, if there's no accountability, people aren't going to move. If we don't challenge people's cultural norms, if we don't challenge people's antiquated values and beliefs, if we don't push to make people step outside their comfort zones, nothing's going to happen. We can rail at our systems and our institutions, but honestly, our systems and our institutions are all made up by people. People have to move. People have to change. People have to want more, better, and different. Everybody wants to blame somebody. But quite honestly, we all need to look in the mirror first. What are we doing or what are we not doing? Are we using the opportunities that we have, the access that we have, the influence that we have to move ourselves in a different direction? Or are we comfortable in our spaces? I told somebody the other day, they asked me, why do you even bother doing like some of the diversity work? Why do you bother speaking out about things? And I think about it sometimes because some days I just want to not do it. You get tired at points in times of speaking out and speaking up and always being that voice, always being in that space. But it's become almost a have to. Because are other people going to say something if certain other people don't? Are people going to think twice about it? I would like just to be comfortable in my space too, run my organization, collect the salary that people think I get, and just enjoy my life. But I can't. And sometimes it's interesting because I know there are people who think that because I'm in the space that I'm in, or the job that I have, or the title that I have, or whatever that is, that maybe I don't experience discrimination any longer, or that maybe it's less. But honestly, it's not. In some ways, being in this space is worse because there's so few of us. The level of expectation is significant. I know that every time that there is an issue around race or culture in this community, especially around race, I'm getting 15 phone calls or 50 phone calls. Last week when the situation happened with the county board, I was in Chicago at a conference. By the time I got out of our meetings at 4 o'clock, I had, 20 calls and 50 emails about it that night. And the question was, Mark, what are you going to do? And I was like, what do you mean, what am I going to do? What are you going to do? What are we going to do? Even my board of directors, which was really interesting, was like, we emailed, because I like I said, I was in Chicago hanging out at Lou Malnati's eating pizza. So, and a couple of members of my board emailed me about what had occurred at the meeting late that night, and asked what our response is going to be. And I'm like, well, you're the board of directors. I work for you. What is your response going to be? What are you going to direct me to do? But those expectations, again, that those few of us that some people believe have achieved some semblance of success that are people of color, that continuous expectation that we are always the ones that speak up and speak out, or that it's our responsibility, our obligation to speak up or speak out. That it's our job to fix it. That's a lot of pressure on a few people. The 4 or 5 of us that always get those phone calls, we talk to each other all the time. Because the phone calls is coming. And the conversation is like, okay, which one of us is going to do it this time? Or do we all need to do it, or how are we going to figure this out? But when you live in a community where, again, that's incredibly segregated, and there are only a few people of color that white people from mainstream spaces have any semblance of relationships with, you're the person that's always going to get the call. I'll never forget the Janesville Gazette article a few years ago that referred to me as Mark Perry, local black man. I was their go-to person, still am. My responsibility to speak for an entire population of people, when some days I can barely speak for myself. How do we create more spaces so that more people have more voices at the table? Because if it's my voice at every table, man, that table is missing a whole lot. And for a decade and a half since I moved back to this community, it's largely just been my voice at the table. Sometimes I get invited because people respect and appreciate my point of view or what I have to say or some of my expertise. And sometimes I get invited because they have to. And I can always tell the difference. There are a lot of people in this community with strong ideas that we need to figure out how to give voice to. So that the person that's quoted in the Beloit Daily News or the Janesville Gazette isn't always Mark Perry. Now, if given a microphone or a reporter calls me, I'm going to give you what I think, especially about this subject. But again, all you're getting is my opinion, my viewpoint, my perspective, my lens, and you're missing out on so many other people's. If that's everybody's only exposure is me and 3 or 4 other people, man, that's limited. That's not inclusion, that's tokenism. And how do we get people to understand that and move forward and move beyond that? And even when I get questions about people wanting to, include more people of color in meetings or in groups or in discussions, the question out of their mouth is always, well, Mark, can you recommend some people? Or Mark, can you call some people and get them to do this? No, those are my relationships. Build your own. It does not benefit anybody if those relationships are just mine. Remember having this conversation years ago with some of the staff at Community Action as we were doing some of our neighborhood engagement work. And I was like, if you want to be connected to the community, you actually have to come out from behind your desk and go in the community. You can't stand behind me. It doesn't work that way. If you want to be accepted in the space, if you want to be welcomed in the space, then you actually have to be present in the space. If you honestly want more people at the table, then you actually have to get out and ask people to come to the table. We can't keep relying on a few people to do all the heavy lifting. And while I appreciate the allies that I have in this community, even our allies have to step up and do better. The issue, folks, aren't the people of color in the community. The issue is your friends, your family, your white friends, your white family members, and your white coworkers that you're not engaging with, that you're not having conversations with, and honestly, that you're not holding accountable for their actions and their words and their deeds. And the truth is, no matter how popular I am or how prominent I am, it's going to always come better from you. Because I can get labeled as an angry black man or as militant or as disgruntled or playing the race card, being a race baiter, all the terms that people throw at me on a pretty consistent basis. Or now, of course, the popular thing is that every time I speak, I'm promoting critical race theory. So if we truly value making our communities inclusive, we all have to start pushing towards that direction. Inclusion is a cultural norm like anything else. And right now, our society is largely segregated and exclusive. And the only way to change that is to change the way that we do things. It's a conscious mindset. It's a daily approach to how we engage with people, how we treat people. It's a daily approach about how we do our work. How do you make sure that, given the change in the country's demographics, that everybody's looking through things through an equity lens? And understanding that that equity lens doesn't exclude anybody. It's just more inclusive of everybody. You know, I always caution people to understand when we talk about the word inclusion, to make sure people understand that inclusion means everybody at the table, not just everybody who agrees with me. So we have to make room for those folks that we maybe have philosophical difference with, or political difference with, or social differences with as well. Because everybody deserves a voice at the table. But then everybody has to agree that when you get a chance to voice your opinion or voice your thoughts or voice your expression, that when the group decides to move in a direction, that we all move in that direction. It is never my expectation that people agree with everything that comes out of my mouth. It is never my expectation that I agree with everything that comes out of somebody else's mouth. What I always hope is that people see the logic and rationale in what I have to say. And what I always strive for is see the logic and rationale in what other people have to say. But we can't even get to the place to be that open. We start formulating our own thoughts and opinions and our response to people before they've even had a chance to fully say what they have to say. One of the biggest parts of inclusion is listening and active listening. But we've become so divisive that anybody that makes any point to the contrary of what me and my allies believe isn't worth listening to. We also are really bad at conversations, especially difficult conversations. You know, when I talk to groups all the time about diversity, equity, inclusion, one of the things I always say to them is that the issue is not that we have too many conversations around race and culture, is that we have too few. We are not good at having that conversation. And the reason why we are not good at having that conversation is because we don't actively practice it. The minute the conversation gets hard, we shut down, we disconnect, we walk away, take our toys and run home, as opposed to sticking in our discomfort and working through the conversation. We get good at things because we practice them. This is an area where we need significant practice. Significant practice. We are never going to be able to move our institutions until we as individuals are able to have the dialogues that we need to have, until we start actively listening to each other. How do we get to that place? We have to be much more conscious about our communication, much more conscious about the way that we treat each other, much more conscious about the way that we respond to things. We have to resist the urge to make snap judgments about people. How do we give people a chance to show who they really are, show their full selves? Most of the time when you walk into a space, before you've opened your mouth, people have already formulated an opinion about you. And that opinion often has nothing to do with you. It's based on their past experiences, their biases, and their stereotypes. And so they associate you with something else. And we all do it. I do it all the time. I have to catch myself to make sure that I don't let my biases negatively impact the way that I interact with people. We're never going to eliminate our biases. We're just not. Some of them are so ingrained in us, we started learning them as infants and toddlers. I'll give you a quick one. Illinois drivers. That is a regional bias. We all started learning it at an early age, to the point where all I have to say is Illinois drivers, and all of you started laughing about it. Some of the biases that we have, some of the rhetoric that comes to us, we've heard so much, so often, so consistently, that it's just a part of who we are. So we have to be conscious about the things that we are biased about. Kids start learning to distinguish against race as early as 6 months old. Kids start exhibiting racial bias as early as 3 years of age. Where is a 3-year-old learning its racial bias from? Oh, absolutely. Thank you. It absolutely is. Parents and caregivers to start, but adults in general. You know, one of the things I always say to educators and say, well, just parents in general as we're working with parents, is keep in mind that kids are always listening and paying attention, especially when we think they're not listening and paying attention. The past couple of years, as I've been working in schools, I mean, I've had encounters with kindergartners who are coming to school saying racist, bigoted things to their classmates. 5-year-olds telling their classmates things like, you're an illegal alien, you shouldn't be here, president's going to build a wall and kick you out. 6-year-olds calling their classmates the N-word. Had a whole fifth grade class of white kids that were routinely fond of calling themselves the N-word, and the school had no idea how to deal with it. But my first question to that school is, to the adults in that space, is, what is the environment that you created that makes a group of kids think that that's okay to do? What cultural norms have you established or not established that make that okay? When I have a whole group of high school students who have swastikas all over their shoes and are drawn on their hands and on their jackets and on their book covers and on the lockers, and I get a phone call asking me to come in and fix that kid. And I'm like, yeah, it's not the kid that needs to be fixed. It's the adults in that space that have the issue. What is the cultural norm? What are the cultural norms that you've established in your school, in your classroom, in your community, that allow kids to think that that is okay? What is the language and information that they are hearing? What is the rhetoric they are getting? And then what is the education that you're doing to counteract that information? If you know you have a problem with anti-Semitism in your school, what are you doing? Are you doing education around the Holocaust? Are you bringing in survivors to talk to the kids? Are you taking your kids on field trips so they're getting educated? Are you talking about the history of anti-Semitism so kids understand? Kids are using anti-Semitic speeches and anti-Semitic terms and don't even know what they're talking about half the time. Or using racist terms and have no idea what they're saying. But what they've picked up on is those terms are hurtful in some way. But they don't know any of the history behind it. And now we have this push to eliminate, some of the things that were some of the oh God, I'm trying to remember how it was put. Some of the darker periods of our American history and not teach those because it makes kids feel bad. The reality of it is in 2023, you cannot keep information from children unless you're going to lock them in the closet and take away all their electronics. Locking kids in the closet is illegal, by the way. Kids have unprecedented access to information. And a lot of the information they have access to via the internet and their friends and their peers is misinformation. So then how do you do the education to counteract that? Because not talking about it is not doing anything. Not teaching it is not helping. Because the misinformation is still out there. We can't sequester kids enough. And you can't protect them from it. I was 5 years old the first time my parents had to explain racism to me. They didn't want to, but they had to because of the situation that we were in. And that was before cell phones and internet. So imagine the access that kids have now. And if you don't have adults giving kids the proper context of the information that they're receiving, you continue to perpetuate biases and stereotypes. You allow kids to be misinformed by other people who want to misinform them. The work of organizations like DAT, the work of organizations like the Y, even the work that we do is great, but it's a drop in the bucket. If you only have a few people in the community rowing a certain way and everybody else is either sitting still or rowing the opposite direction, we're never going to get to the place where we have inclusive communities. All of us have to be doing this. Rock County is a very small community. If we want something done, we can get it done. If we want changes to occur, we can do it. There is no problem that we have that if we're all rowing in the same direction that we can't fix. Our biggest problem is that half of us are sitting on our hands. A third of us are rowing in the opposite, and a third of us are rowing in the opposite directions. And then a third of us are desperately scrambling, trying to get people to pay attention. And that is a formula for disaster. So I'll end my conversation with this. Everybody's got some sphere of influence. Everybody. Even if it's just as simple as influencing and impacting the values and beliefs of your children and your family. Question is, are people actually going to take advantage of the spheres of influence they have to try to push other people in the right direction? And I get that speaking up and speaking out is hard. Nobody wants to be alienated. Nobody wants to be ostracized. Nobody wants to be disenfranchised from the groups that they belong to. Nobody does. I don't either. But if we don't start challenging even the people who are closest to us about their values, their beliefs, their biases, their stereotypes, their bigotry, their racism, if we can't even do that, we're never going to be able to fix our systems and institutions if we're not willing to fix our families and ourselves, our families, and our friends first. And again, not everybody's going to buy into it. Not everybody's going to want to listen to what you have to say. But if you're not even trying, then you're part of the problem. If we really value diversity, equity, and inclusion, as everybody in this community keeps telling me we do, then I have to start saying more than lip service. I was born and raised in Wisconsin. I love Wisconsin. I was born and raised in Beloit. I love that community. I love Rock County. But we're never going to be the community that we want to be if we aren't an inclusive community. We're going to lose people and not gain people. Institutions that don't evolve die. And if we can't attract new people in because they don't feel welcome and accepted here, we're going to be in really dire straits. We have to start pushing towards inclusion. Everybody does. And whether it's working through Diversity Action Team or working through the Y or working with another organization or just having conversations on your own, the work's got to start somewhere the work's got to start now. We are in a very precarious space in our world right now. And for some people, it's not affecting them yet. For some of us, it affects us every single day. But eventually, it's going to impact all of us. I wouldn't wish some of the things I go through in this community on my worst enemy. There isn't a day that goes by that somebody doesn't say some kind of ignorant, bigoted, racist thing to me. From the moment I leave my house in the morning to the moment I walk back into my house in my evening, I have to be on guard. And it's not paranoia, because every time I let my guard down, I get slapped in the face. It would be really nice if for once the community that I love so much actually loved me. It would be really nice if the children of color in our community didn't have to experience discrimination, bias, and racism. If they could just go to school and be kids. They could just traverse the community and just be kids. But they don't get to. And that is the fault of every adult in this community. If we can't agree on the baseline that children deserve more and better and different, I don't know that there's any hope for us. And all children, not just brown children, all children deserve better. We'll just keep things going to status quo. But eventually status quo is going to kill all of us. And that is my upbeat conversation for the afternoon. Thanks for having me. I don't know if people realize how difficult it is if you live in a large urban center in this country, if you're a person of color, how difficult it is to get to vote. The limiting of polling places in urban communities is atrocious. It just, people get in line and stand in line for hours just to get to vote because polling places continue to get eliminated. That's a big one. So for the police department, it's made a world of difference because it's not just Chief Sale's skin color, it's his commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion that matters. It's him hearing for years about not being able to hire women or not being able to hire people of color in law enforcement, and then him going out and doing it and literally changing the face of our law of our officers. It's a superintendent who is focused on accomplishment, but also has to have the support of the community. Beloit just went after a referendum that was voted down. He's in a position where, the title means something, but in terms of actual power, there isn't a lot there right now. It's a failing school district, and the community is a large swath of the community has stopped supporting the district and stopped supporting the kids in the district. So a lot of his work has been in his first 3 months in office, his first 3 months holding a position, is just getting out in the community, trying to re-engage people to give a damn about the school district again and care about the kids. The city council is unprecedented, and the good thing about the council is not just about their skin color, but about being socially conscious. Skin color alone doesn't always sway. I mean, we've seen it in major cities where, you have people of color in certain positions, but, like other people in those positions, sometimes they'll use that position for their own personal gain and screw the rest of the community. Bad politicians are bad politicians regardless of race or ethnicity. So you have to have people who are focused on the work, regardless of skin color. But does it help? Because is it really cool that our kids get to see a superintendent of schools as African American? Absolutely. Is it really cool that our kids get to see city council members, elected officials who are people of color? You better believe it. Is it really great that our kids see our police chief? Because that was something when I was a kid in Beloit, didn't see. Is it neat for kids freak out when they see me? Parents walk in our building are like, when they ask to speak to the director and I come out, they're like, no, we want to talk to the director. I'm like, nope, that's still me. And they're like, really? Yep, I'm the person. Like the kids are like, that's Mr. Mark. He's in charge of all of this. So it doesn't make it absolutely makes an impact. It absolutely makes a difference. But at some point, what you want that to be is a cultural norm. So it's not a big deal. How do we get to the place where that's no longer a big deal, where it's just part of society, where chief sales is an anomaly, where our city council is an anomaly, where somebody like me isn't an anomaly? That's true equity when it just happens. I think about sports because I'm a sports nerd. I think about, the history, especially the history of football, the discrimination that's gone on in the history of pro sports and college sports. Black athletes, black coaches, black general managers, black owners. People always, people this year, like, why was it a big deal that there were two African American quarterbacks starting in the Super Bowl? Because it's never happened before in the history of the league. But when that becomes a cultural norm, then we won't make a big deal out of it. Because right now, we're still in some ways in that area, in that gray area of tokenism. So yes, it is a huge accomplishment for those folks who have made their way through and been able to get in that space. But there's still far too many people who don't have that access and opportunity. And again, the pressure on the few people who are in that space to try to open the doors up for everybody is tremendous. Conversations with the council members, with chief sales all the time about the level of expectation. I get the phone calls all the time. One of the first people to approach me, one of the first things I got asked after I got the executive director job at Community Action 3 years ago was, what are you going to do for the black community? And I'm like, well, where have you been the last 14 years? Have you not seen? But immediately it shifted because now I'm in this role. The expectations are different, but I'm like, everything that's gone on in Beloit Community Action the past 14 years that's benefited the community, who do you think has been driving that? So while you get in those spaces, you still end up with a great deal of scrutiny and expectation. And, it's a level of expectation that, I told my board of directors when I got the job, my ED role is going to look different. You can count, our organization is 58 years old. You can count on one hand with a couple of fingers left of the number of people of color who've been in a senior leadership position in our agency. So you still have, even though you have folks in those positions, you still have a culture that is largely not accepting. And we do the work that we can in the space that we're allowed, but believe me, the pressure on chief sales is tremendous. His mistakes are blown up. My mistakes are blown up. City council mistakes are blown up. So when we get to the place where our successes and our failures can be judged equitably, when we get to the place where, again, those things are cultural norms, then we've accomplished something. And I'm not diminishing because I know what it took for Chief Sales to get where he's at. I know the kind of stuff, the pressure that our city council members are under, because I know the pressure that I feel every day. It is tremendous what they've all accomplished. It is tremendous to get to the spaces that they're in, because it's not what the system is designed to have happen. So to get to one of those positions is significant. To keep one of those positions is significant. To actually have a level of influence is significant. Because for most people, still, they don't expect you to be there in the first place. When I got hired at Community Action 17 years ago, the number of times people accused me of, or accused my executive director at the time of hiring me as a diversity hire. Not because I was qualified, not because I was capable, not because I was competent, but I was a diversity hire. That's the kind of pressure that the superintendent's under. That's the kind of pressure that chief is under. That's the kind of pressure that our city council people are under. That feeling that we don't necessarily belong there, that we're there because of something in the system, some kind of anomaly, or that we took a seat from somebody white. So while it is progress, it's progress with a lot of layers to it. Thanks for having me, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.